Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I'm Max Reimer, your host. So often we talk about money in politics. Well, that's one factor of what influences an election. Another big factor is the grassroots efforts. And we're here to talk with an expert on grassroots efforts. We have Kelly Gunderson, who is the Grassroots Director of Americans for Prosperity. Nickname is NASCAR Kelly.
Yes.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me to be here. It's wonderful.
We love to talk about these types of campaign efforts on the show. And I think there's not really anyone that we could think of better to talk to than someone who does grassroots trainings as you do. And we'll get into that a little bit. We'll talk about what you do, but first I want to talk about who you are, all right? So your Twitter handle and your nickname is NASCAR Kelly.
Yep, exactly.
Where does that come from?
Okay, so that comes from my love of NASCAR.
Okay.
Several years ago, so I'm also kind of known as Kelly from Lino Lakes through talk radio. I've been...
A lot of nicknames.
I know, it's kind of weird, but it all works out. I've been a talk radio fanatic since I was a little kid. My dad would have it on the radio in the car or at home, and I'd listen. And there's two people who I really became a big fan of, Joe Souchere and Patrick Royce, and they do sports talk. And I remember them from being a kid, and I started kind of calling in about different things, and then kind of realized that nobody was talking about NASCAR, even though I was a fan of it. And so I started calling in, and Patrick Royce gave me the nickname of NASCAR Kelly, and it stuck.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a big name giving you that nickname.
Well, there's not a lot of fans of NASCAR in Minnesota, so I'm trying to reach out to some and kind of get what we like to call a NASCAR caucus together.
Okay.
Just people who like NASCAR, try to find out how much of a fan base there is in Minnesota. So there was some. It works out.
Your expertise is in kind of grassroots organizing and politics. Where did that come from? What in your background led you down this path to grassroots advocacy and training?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've always been, politics is in my blood, and I'm not quite sure how, but it is. I can kind of trace back some political activity throughout my family. I've had a couple uncles run for public office. My dad was, always talking about politics and news events, and I started reading the newspaper when I was a little kid. Back when I was a kid, you get the afternoon delivery still, when I was really little, and I'd wait for the paper to come out, and I'd sit down and I'd read it after school. And so I've always had this kind of wanting to get involved in politics, and I actually, as a teenager, was more aligned with the Democrats. I volunteered for some campaigns in St. Paul, and just really liked getting involved. Well, then I grew up, bought a house in St. Paul, and started listening to some people like Joe Souchere, this guy named Jason Lewis.
Never heard of him.
I don't know, where he's somewhere in the South Metro, East Metro.
You started taking on responsibilities.
I started listening, and I actually was disagreeing, but then I started figuring out that I was agreeing more. And actually, the first time I filed for federal taxes as an 18-year-old was right after President Clinton became president.
Okay.
And I had to write a check with my filing as an 18-year-old working two part-time jobs. I messed up something, but it was actually the 1993 Tax Act that President Clinton passed and signed that retroactively raised income taxes on the federal side. And I had to write a check, and I think it was only like $16.
Yeah.
But it was enough for me to go, what's going on? I should be getting a refund. I'm working 2 part-time jobs. I was trying to go to school. Why am I writing a check? So it kind of started me down this path of thinking, what's my government doing?
Yeah.
What's it doing with my money? And I'd always paid attention. I was paying attention now in a different way.
Absolutely.
And so then in 1996, I voted for a Republican candidate for Bob Dole. And that led me to getting involved in the Republican Party, local campaigns, activist groups, and that led me to about 20 years of advocacy in the Republican Party. And recently, in fact, in 2016, I kind of saw this wave of people coming in, and I started to kind of take a step back to let other people get more involved. And but then this opportunity came up, and I saw that this position with Americans for Prosperity became open. And they've been doing great things in Minnesota. I've been following them since 2015.
Yeah.
And I decided I want to give this a shot. So I applied and interviewed, and I got the job. And I'm loving what I do for Americans for Prosperity.
And you know, it is really interesting to hear you talk about how just one real life influence impacted for presumably the rest of your life, your politics. As I mentioned in the intro, there are big money in politics and ad buys and you know, a lot of digital marketing stuff. Now, it kind of gets the headlines of campaigns on both a statewide and national level.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit philosophically about the importance of grassroots, how you perceive it to be. Why does it matter still?
So you know, as you said, the ads really, you know, make a big difference. I shouldn't say a big difference, but it's what gets the attention, the spending, the campaign spending. You know, when you're heading into a big race like in Minnesota or a national race, you know, you hear about the millions of dollars and the billions of dollars that are being spent, and that's important because you want to get recognition, you want to get name ID out there and things like that. But what I think matters the most, and what led me to this position with Americans for Prosperity, is the one-on-one conversations that people have. And I think that's most effective. It's having a conversation with your neighbor about an issue, and about doing it in the right way, where you're not you know, bloviating over what you think is right, what should be done, but having a real conversation face to face, or having, you know, a small group of people. And that's, I think, what makes more of a difference in terms of getting people to see another side and convincing people that maybe the right way to go on a certain issue is maybe down this path.
Right. So it's people-centered versus money-centered in many cases.
Yeah. And I think actually when, you know, the media likes to talk about the big numbers, it likes to talk about, you know, the big profiles. Well, that's what media does. But when you get down to just in the neighborhood and talking neighbor to neighbor or coworker to coworker, you know, you're having a beer after work or something like that, that's what really makes the difference.
Right. So by definition, you know, you are the director of Grassroots for this organization.
For the state of Minnesota, yes.
Yep. What is Grassroots? I think we can lump a lot of things into grass. I mean, Hillary Clinton was talking about, you know, she was running a grassroots campaign.
Right.
You know? So I think it becomes this sexy term to talk about. What actually is it? What are you doing on a daily basis? What can we improve on in Minnesota?
So, you know, away from politics, what Americans for Prosperity, what we work on is actually issues and issue advocacy. So we're not out there doing a lot of campaigning or endorsing or things like that. What we work on is an issue that we think is going to affect the most amount of people in the most real and direct way. So things like healthcare reform, tax reform, and even down to the smaller issues where it gets down to a county level or city level. Things like a tobacco restriction. Up in Duluth recently, our state director, Jason Flores, went up there to speak to the city council when they were about to vote in an ordinance on restricting tobacco sales in terms of the type of tobacco, so flavored tobacco and menthol and things like that. And it's not about restricting in terms of age, but it's restricting in terms of what businesses and what the small convenience store owners can sell.
Right.
And how that actually hurts business owners and the store owners, how it hurts them the most because it affects their real revenue.
Yeah.
It's a legal product, and it's certainly the city council's right to do that, but there are real implications about that.
Yeah.
There's real direct effect on that.
Right.
And so we'll talk about issues like that. We'll talk about local issues. Maybe there may be a school board issue coming up. There may be a city issue where if we think it's going to hurt a lot of people in the long run, we'll make some advocacy moves on it.
Very good. How does the normal Joe Schmo who knows that they want to get involved in let's just keep it issue specific.
Yeah.
How do they get involved? Where do you even start with that? You know, because I could hear, I guess, in the newspaper or in a news story something about, let's just say, the menthol ordinance in Duluth. how then would I use an organization like yours to get involved?
So at Americans for Prosperity, we do a couple different things besides issue advocacy, but we also do training. We do activist training. We do one-on-one type of classes on maybe a single subject. And so if people are interested in a certain subject and they want to get involved in advocacy training or activist training, they should go to americansforprosperity.org and they can get involved with us there. There's other organizations that do also issue advocacy. The best way is to start having conversations, but also getting in touch with your elected officials. And no matter what party or who represents you, if you feel strongly on something, really you should be letting your representatives know how you feel about something. A lot of people have said, and I've heard this in the past, that, well, I'm just one voice, it's not going to make a difference. But that one voice, as a politician or an elected official is getting information, that's what's going to influence their vote the most, is hearing from their constituents. So I always say that that's probably the most effective. Now beyond that, at Americans for Prosperity, when we talk about activist training, we talk about how to have the most impact on contacting your elected officials. And so you have to, there's different tips on calling, emailing, writing a letter, going to a town hall, going to an outreach meeting that maybe an elected official staff is doing. There's lots of different ways, but it's also about messaging correctly too. If you write a 3-page letter to your elected official, it may not have as much influence as if you write a few paragraphs on what's important, why you feel the way on an issue, and that you are hoping that your elected official will see your side of that issue. And I think that has the most impact on it.
So getting to that training specifically, and really, Kelly, I don't want you to give away the whole farm on this thing.
That's okay.
You guys can get in touch with Kelly, right, if you want to participate in some of these trainings. Walk us through what an average training session looks like, an activist training session, because you made mention of a few kind of high-level things. I'd be interested to hear about what actually goes down in those types of trainings.
It's about, first of all, just, in training, getting to know the people that you're in the class with, getting to know who's presenting, getting to know the trainer, and then as the training goes along, it can be it's getting to know the people, but then listening and getting a different perspective on how activism really starts, how it continues. How do you build a community? So say you want to build a campaign on a local city referendum. How do you get people in your corner, and how do you create a good community that goes out and spreads the message of how you want that referendum to go? So it leads to that. There's also some other things on how different sides of the political aisles, what they do, and really working out what works best for your own community. So instead of building networks, you're building communities. Communities seem to be more effective.
That's right.
And they get the most done.
With Grassroots in mind, specifically in the state of Minnesota, and I don't want to bloviate too much on this thing, although we're pretty good at bloviation.
Sure, everybody in politics is.
In Minnesota, from what you've seen in your personal experience, with the activist crowd, if it's politician specific or issue specific, what can we do better as a state?
As a state, when you say we, I think the best thing is kind of what I've been saying all along, is to have the conversations where you're not overpowering your opinion on somebody, but you're really trying to make a connection, and you're listening as well as talking, and to find where you have common ground on someone on an issue. A lot of people what I've been saying recently is don't necessarily judge a book by its cover. So just because somebody is in a certain profession, a certain occupation, they live in a certain part of town, try not to let that be a part of your thinking on how to approach someone. Approach someone you probably already have a personal connection with, and talk to them as if you're sitting down having a cup of coffee. And maybe it's inviting a few people. our certified activist training, we had a session back in the summer.
Okay.
I recently got in touch with one of our graduates from that program, and she is passionate about an issue that she thinks is coming up in the state legislature. And she used her training to contact through a different organization some women that she thought might be interested in this topic as well, and invited them over to her house for lunch. She invited about 20 women. I think she had about half show up.
Okay.
She had a few more that said, I can't make it, but I'm interested. And they had this great conversation over lunch. They kind of came to a consensus of how they wanted to approach this subject with the legislature, and they have a plan that's starting to go into action. And
Wow.
so, it's those kind of meetings and interactions
Yeah.
that really work the best.
Yeah, I think what's important is because everyone is passionate about these issues. So even let's just say on the other side of our political aisle, right? And I say our as in Republicans. You have a lot of controversy right now around gun control, right? Because of what happened with the Florida shooting and that kind of thing. And I think about, a lot of these kids that are going on TV, that are being interviewed and that kind of thing. And I do find it fascinating, although I do disagree with their position on the issue. You almost think that this could be better served through a grassroots activation, because otherwise you're almost just making people angry for the sake of making them angry, versus getting on someone's level like you talked about and having a one-to-one conversation, which in society it doesn't happen much anymore. But just as kind of an observation from what I've seen with these most recent events kind of playing out, is that we're more likely to go in front of a camera than we are in front of our neighbor on any given issue.
And I think you could look at that the same way with social media. Social media, especially right now, I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot of just people out there talking. They think they write a good tweet, and it gets a few likes, it gets a few retweets, and then that they're doing something. Really.
Hashtag activism.
Yeah, it may have a certain point. You may find that you are finding other people through social media that may think the same way that you do on a certain issue. But really what it takes then, what I've been trying to do, is also then connecting with, hey, I noticed you wrote this, or I noticed you posted this on Facebook. Hey, I'm kind of interested in that.
Yeah.
Some people are finding online communities. That's a way of getting together, but really it's the face-to-face, it's the person-to-person contact that really makes, I keep saying it really makes the difference, but it really does. A tweet isn't going to win somebody over on an issue, but it makes you feel good when you do it.
Yeah, it's ultimately confirmation bias in most cases.
But, there's a good part of it where, I use Facebook to connect with people, and I say, hey, do you know that, this meeting is coming up, or we've got this training coming up with Americans for Prosperity. Interested in joining us? So it has its good points, but really what makes the big difference is talking one-on-one.
One thing that, and I'm just curious, is if this is part of your activist training specifically, because I think what we're talking about right now, kind of getting on one-on-one level with people that you know. What about people that you don't necessarily know? So just specifically, I'm talking door knocking. Is that something that Americans for Prosperity also trains on? Because that relationship can look a little bit different.
Yeah, we do training on that. I think that's a little later on in our activist training. So what we have actually coming up, and I'm not sure if it's going to make it to airtime, is we do have a series for activist training coming up in early March. And we have a first level kind of basic training, and then we go into the second level, and that may get a little bit more into that in a second level. But, I've done some door knocking on issues. At Americans for Prosperity, we connect with people, face to face through the door. We may call people on a certain issue in a certain area just to say, are you aware of this issue coming up? And how do you feel about it? And we also share some information through that as well. So, and I know it's in issue advocacy, but it's also in campaigning. It's a little daunting to go up to a door to somebody that you don't know, knock on the door and say, hi, I'm here with so-and-so, and I'm here on this issue, and I wanted to just give you this information. You know, can I ask you, are you interested in this? Is this an issue you've been following? You know, do you have an opinion on it either way? But for activists that are out there doing that, you know, what I find is, okay, kind of psych yourself up for it. And after you find that you've done a few doors or a few phone calls, you kind of get into this rhythm, and you know, you find that, and it's the conversation that you have at the door with somebody may, you know, boost you to get another 12 done because you had this really good conversation with somebody. And so I think it is effective. We do it at Americans for Prosperity when we're advocating for an issue. It's like I said, the one-on-one conversation that seems to work the best, and it's daunting to do door knocking and do phone calls, but it's when I get done doing it, I just find it was like, oh, I had these great conversations today, and yeah, I had some ones that didn't go that great, and that probably went negative. Had a few doors slammed in my face. Oh well, you know, you kind of put them aside, and the 5 or 6 you've had in an hour that really made a difference, just keep you going.
That's right. Within Americans for Prosperity, then, you talked a lot about issue-specific initiatives. What are some things on your docket that are coming up in terms of issues in Minnesota that you're focusing on? So
we put out the roadmap for Minnesota. So if you go to mnroadmap.com, we've got our 5-point plan for what we think the legislature should be focusing on this year. Things like entrepreneurship, less regulation, less taxes. There's a big issue coming up of tax conformity. That is coming up with the federal tax changes that were done last year. Well, Minnesota needs to catch up. We're a very high tax state. And if the legislature doesn't make some changes,
we're going to get socked.
We're going to end up getting hurt in Minnesota. And we are hopeful that we're seeing some promise in the legislature, and we're hoping the governor will go along. And so there's those types of points that we're hoping that will happen this year.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. And activating people to make the case to their specific legislator is kind of the initiative behind some of those efforts.
And there's some federal issues that are coming up as well. There is talk of a federal gas tax hike. With the talk of infrastructure coming up, there is a gas tax proposal being floated, and from what we know, there is support for it on both sides of the aisle. And so we at Americans for Prosperity are talking to people. We just started talking to people this past week of, are you aware? It's not an issue that's made a lot of headlines yet. We think it will as it progresses in the Congress. And we want to make sure people are aware that that's coming up and that they need to act on it if they feel that that's going to hurt their family, if it's going to hurt their parents that are on fixed incomes, and overall, you know, hurting the economy. After we made these great gains with tax reform, we want to make sure we don't lose it in other legislation.
Within your training, you had just made mention of one young lady who seemed to be a pretty good case study on an issue that she cared about. What has kind of the response been to this training? Are you seeing a lot of people get activated on their own, or is it still kind of a hand-holding process after they quote-unquote graduate from the program?
Well, you know, the first level that I had done as a new grassroots director for Americans for Prosperity, I had 25 graduates, which was phenomenal, just a fabulous group. And I've tried really hard to keep in touch with them. A couple of them have gotten in touch with me to say, hey, I'm kind of interested in this, or are you guys doing something about this issue? And really creating a sense of community with activists with Americans for Prosperity in Minnesota. And then I'm hoping to later on this year offer the second level of activist training so that those graduates get even more training and keep going in what's important to them on staying active. So I wouldn't say hand-holding, but I would say there's a good base of communication that will continue as we go.
Because it is a consistency thing too. You know, there's a big part of committing to a grassroots effort like this, even when you can't see the forest for the trees in a lot of ways.
Right, and what we've talked about Americans for Prosperity, and we did it a lot last year too, is last year was considered to be an off year, an odd year. There's not big national elections. There really isn't. There's not statewide elections. You're focusing on the local elections. That's even a better time to get involved in issue advocacy because the attention isn't there on the candidates. It's on the issues.
Right.
And so we made, like I said, we made big strides with our certified activist training, with some other issues and with tax reform. And that's really the best way. A lot of people in Minnesota say, people don't pay attention until after the state fair.
Yeah.
And really that needs to change.
Okay.
It's a year long.
Do you agree with that general sentiment or no?
That's a really good question. I would say it's really hard because when you look at 2016, it really was a continuous, but that's a national issue. And national issues always seem to get more attention, to get more involvement. And so it's hard to say, but when you're talking about election season, after the state fair, people kind of take more attention. But I think that needs to change, and I think it is changing. I think as just an electorate, just the average person who goes out and votes, I think that you'll see there's more attention being paid. Now, is there more work being done? I'm not sure. I think that's something I'll have to watch for a couple of cycles to see how it goes. Right. But I think with President Trump, and with different people in elected office, I think people are starting to pay more attention throughout the year and not just waiting till 6 weeks before a certain election.
Very good. So you mentioned the Americans for Prosperity website. You have another training that's coming up in early March. Online will probably be up by that time. After that, Kelly, what else do you have going on throughout the year? What kind of initiatives do you have going on even closer to November?
So all throughout the year, we usually try to do single issue classes on through Americans for Prosperity. So we'll do a single issue one night on the moral case for capitalism, or how to be a more effective advocate for a certain issue. There's a list of classes that we try to do, once a month, maybe once every other month. We do hold other events. We've held events. We just held one a couple weeks ago. We had our session kickoff, our legislative session kickoff, where we invited the Speaker of the House, Kurt Daudt, and the Senate Majority Leader, Paul Gazelka, to have a conversation. So we weren't necessarily saying, oh yeah, rah, rah, rah.
Right. But
what we were doing is, what's your plan, and how does that work with Americans for Prosperity and our principles and what we're hoping gets done in the legislative session? It was a great conversation.
Great.
It was really wonderful. We had about 75 people attend.
That's a great turnout.
So we try to do free events like that, where we invite people who are involved, who want to be involved, who want to get more information, to come and join us for certain events. And we'll do different events throughout the year.
Kelly, one more time, how can people get in touch with you and your organization if they care about a specific issue and really want to learn how to be an activist?
So you go to americansforprosperity.org. It will automatically lead you to the Minnesota chapter in Minnesota, which is great. We've got lots of information on there about issues that we're following, things that we're doing, and also then we have our Grassroots Leadership Academy is our sister organization through our foundation, and that's where we do our education through. So our certified activist training is starting in early March, and you can go to that through glaminnesota.com. glaminnesota.com. And that will get you to the registration page for our advocacy. If you're seeing this program after that training has started, still go to the website. Look at you can also go to mnroadmap.com and look at our 5-point plan for the Minnesota legislature session this year. And if you like what we're hoping that the legislature focuses on, our 5-point plan, we want you to endorse it. So click on the endorse button, fill out the information, and you'll become more, you'll have more communication from Americans for Prosperity, and you'll find out what we're going to do this year.
Very good.
Yeah.
Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. NASCAR Kelly.
Yeah, thanks, Max. It was great being here.
And if you want to get involved, make sure you rewind the tape a little bit and get that contact information down that Kelly provided. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Republican Roundtable. I'm Max Reimer, your host. We'll see you next time.